What if the world's biggest problems, I mean the really catastrophic issues like war, chronic hunger, pandemic disease, what if they aren't the real problems we should be focusing on? Welcome to the Deep Dive. That is the profoundly provocative question that kicks off our analysis today. We are looking at a remarkable stack of sources, articles, white papers, research notes that all make one single sweeping argument. And that argument is that the true root cause of global chaos isn't scarcity. It's something much simpler, much more painful. A lack of coordination, trust, and, well, a unified global strategy. So our mission today is to immerse ourselves in a hypothetical but frighteningly detailed 2026 scenario. In this world, humanity decides to tackle that one core issue, global cooperation. We're going to try and extract the precise mechanisms and the surprising impacts of this massive proposed fix, which the sources call the Global Stability Agreement, or GSA.
And right away, the source material just confronts you with this core paradox. The reason an agreement like this is even necessary.
The world isn't broken because we lack resources. I mean, we know factually we produce enough food to feed 10 billion people right now.
10 billion.
The system is failing because of fragmentation. It's leading to these fragmented, often contradictory solutions. The crisis isn't resource depletion, it's a catastrophic coordination failure where everyone is, working at cross purposes.
So what's so fascinating is how the sources frame the GSA. This isn't born from some idealistic utopian fever dream.
Not at all.
They describe it as a shocking agreement. And it's signed by the traditional and often fierce geopolitical rivals.
Yeah.
The United States, China, Russia, India, the EU, and Brazil.
That lineup alone tells you everything you need to know. The authors really emphasize that the central motivation here is not altruism, it's not even goodwill, it's radical mutual loss aversion.
Radical mutual loss aversion. So what does that mean in practice?
It means every single nation involved, from the G7 to the big emerging economies, they all realized they were losing more economically, socially, politically from continued chaos than they would from being forced to cooperate.
So the cost of doing nothing finally became higher than the cost of working together.
Exactly. And the commitments they make, they're not based on handshakes. The sources describe them as verifiable and absolutely ironclad.
Okay, so let's unpack this. If global cooperation is the single lever we pull, how does this new world immediately begin to solve crises that are decades old? Let's start with the most basic, most visceral problem: chronic hunger.
The initial data the sources give us is it's almost offensive in its inefficiency. 735 million people are facing chronic hunger today. Meanwhile, we waste 1.3 billion tons of food every year. And if you do the math, that wasted food is statistically enough to feed all the chronically hungry 4 times over.
4 times. That's the definition of a coordination failure. The food is there, but the pathways are blocked.
Completely.
Aid has always been the historical answer,
Yeah.
right? But that often just treats a symptom. So how does this GSA mechanism fix the systemic failure in the supply chain itself?
The GSA solution is structural. It focuses on integrating food logistics across borders. It treats staple food supplies not as a national asset to be hoarded with tariffs, but as a global resource that has to be, ruthlessly managed for efficiency.
And who's leading this integration?
The US, China, and the EU. They're mandated to integrate their vast logistics systems using artificial intelligence.
That seems like an unbelievable political hurdle. Are you telling me they're sharing proprietary logistics data, port access, inventory management?
They have to. The GSA mechanism forces that level of transparency. The sources detail a scenario where the AI module instantly identifies surpluses. Maybe it's corn sitting in silos in Iowa or processed food in a factory outside Shenzhen.
Right.
And it redirects that supply in real time, bypassing customs friction, bypassing local distribution bottlenecks, and sending it directly to regions of acute need. They specifically cite Somalia and Yemen.
So it eliminates the time delay and the profit motive that keeps necessary goods stuck.
It completely cuts them out.
That real-time redirection, eliminating all those layers of friction, that really is the game changer.
Yeah.
So what's the immediate result? What's the verifiable outcome?
The result is staggering because the problem was so solvable to begin with. The sources claim that while hunger doesn't just vanish overnight, for the first time in over 50 years, global chronic hunger is reduced by 40%.
40%.
In the first 2 years of GSA. It's just an enormous win, and it comes from stopping waste and increasing transparency, not from charity.
It's clear that a lack of coordination wastes resources, but where we see it fail most catastrophically is when it leads to conflict. So let's transition from food logistics to actual fighting. War and geopolitics. That's the traditional domain where cooperation just dies first. We've seen current conflicts tear regions apart. The sources highlight the war in Ukraine, the most destructive conflict in Europe since World War II, along with crises in Gaza, Sudan, and Myanmar. So if the drivers of these conflicts are emotional, historical, deeply rooted, how does the GSA force coordination on adversaries that are already locked in these destructive cycles?
The mechanism is built entirely around incentives and mutual cost avoidance. It's the GSA's whole theme, really.
Okay.
The sources highlight that Moscow and Kiev are forced to use a new financial mechanism, one that provides huge economic bonuses linked directly to verifiable de-escalation benchmarks.
So we're talking about things like access to specialized credit markets.
Yeah.
Reconstruction funds.
Exactly, and it's instantly tied to independent verification of a ceasefire, of a pullback.
So it shifts the financial calculus. It's not just win at all costs anymore, it's cooperate for profit.
Okay.
It makes the cost of fighting immediately and demonstrably more expensive than the cost of peace.
That's it, precisely. The GSA removes the national economic shield. If you violate the agreement, you don't just face sanctions from one country, you face global financial isolation from a coalition that represents 75% of global GDP.
Wow.
And the sources also mention that this transparency extends to the flow of weapons.
How so?
Well, as part of this wider push for verifiable stability, arms supplies become globally transparent. The major manufacturers, Russia, the US, China, France, they have to log and verify all sales through a unified system.
Which effectively eliminates the gray market deals, the black box sales, that keep these smaller regional wars going indefinitely.
Right. The assumption is if everyone knows where the tanks are coming from, the political pressure becomes immediate and global.
But the ultimate geopolitical fear, I
Yeah.
mean, the one risk that trumps all others,
Yeah.
the still nuclear catastrophe. Fragmentation here means literal annihilation.
And this is maybe the most politically and technically difficult part of the whole agreement. And for that reason, it's the most critical aha moment in the sources. The GSA demands the creation of a unified nuclear risk. That sensor error that was nearly misinterpreted as a genuine attack. By relying on a single, shared, algorithmically verified module, the potential for misinterpretation leading to annihilation it's dramatically reduced.
Yeah.
It's mutual survival, codified through enforced, automated trust.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because cooperation doesn't just impact battlefield strategy or existential threats. It hits people where they live, their health, both physical and mental.
Absolutely. We're moving from immediate survival to quality of life. And the challenge in global health is access. It's not necessarily innovation. 2 billion people worldwide lack reliable access to essential medicines.
And the power dynamics here are key because the sources point out exactly who holds the manufacturing leverage in pharmaceuticals.
That's right, China and India. Together, they control something like 70% of the world's pharmaceutical components and generic drug manufacturing. The GSA leverages this economic concentration for good.
How does that actually translate into medicine reaching a remote village somewhere?
They create a transparent, unified global supply platform. The mandate forces China and India to prioritize sending cheap, high-quality generic drugs directly to nations in Africa and Southeast Asia. And crucially, the GSA provides the international enforcement muscle needed to bypass those corrupt local distribution systems that have choked off access for decades.
Bypassing that local corruption through global enforcement?
Yeah.
That's a massive lift. What's the humanitarian consequence of that transparency?
The result, according to the sources, is profound and immediate. Life expectancy in Central Africa exceeds 60 years for the first time in recorded history.
But it's from that one act of cooperation.
Just think about that. A single act of supply chain transparency enforced by global trade powers delivers a massive jump in humanitarian outcome. It really makes you realize how solvable some of these problems are.
That success story, achieved purely through logistics, makes you question what other impossible problems could be solved. But 21st century health isn't just about physical survival, it's about what the sources call the silent disasters. Gambling addiction, the massive spike in mental health issues, crippling loneliness. We're talking about 280 million people worldwide suffering from depression, and it's often made worse by technology.
And this section of the sources describes a truly radical shift in what governments prioritize. Up until the GSA, governments mostly protected the revenue and growth of tech companies.
Right.
In the GSA world, major global tech platforms, doesn't matter what country they're from, are required to implement internationally harmonized measures designed to block technological addiction.
What specific mechanisms are we talking about here? Mandatory logouts?
Yes. specific mandatory measures, things like hard stop warnings, required breaks after you've been on for a while, and crucially, something they call stress quotas.
Stress quotas.
The sources describe them as algorithmic caps that monitor user behavior, things like excessive aggressive interactions or time spent viewing harmful content, and they automatically throttle your access or just force a disconnection once you hit those quotas.
Social media platforms introducing mandatory breaks on their own engagement metrics. That goes completely against their current business model. How does the GSA enforce that globally?
It connects compliance directly to market access. If a platform refuses to implement the GSA's addiction mitigation standards, the GSA signatories, who represent most of the world's consumer markets, simply agree to block their App Store access or their advertising revenue.
So it's an acknowledgement that the psychological cost of addiction is now treated as a global stability risk.
Exactly. Governments are finally protecting citizens' psyches, not just protecting app traffic. And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, the GSA forces global powers to address the darkest corners of their supply chains and behavior, things that previously national sovereignty made impossible to audit. Let's turn to the horrific, persistent issue of modern slavery.
The scale of this problem is, it's often conveniently overlooked. But the sources are blunt. 50 million modern slaves worldwide, primarily in supply chains running through India, Pakistan, and China. And the fragmentation of the global economy is what allows corporations to turn a blind eye, to claim ignorance about where their raw materials are coming from. How does the GSA actually introduce accountability into these deeply entrenched shadow systems?
This is where the ironclad commitment truly earns its name. Under immense pressure from the Accord, corporations lose the absolute right to purchase raw materials from supply chains that are not verified and internationally audited.
So the U.S. government couldn't buy steel from a Chinese manufacturer if that manufacturer refuses a GSA-mandated ethical audit.
That's the mechanism.
But wait, is China, as a major GSA signatory, actually agreeing to open its domestic supply chains to external audits? I mean, that's the kind of political capitulation that seems impossible.
It is the ultimate test of that loss aversion principle we talked about. The mechanism is simple and brutal. Any country, even a signatory, that refuses those external audits is instantly subject to a unified, global trade ban from the entire GSA coalition. The economic isolation is the enforcement.
They realize the cost of sheltering those supply chains is now greater than the cost of reforming them.
At the end of the day, yes.
And what is the immediate, measurable impact of that economic pressure?
The sources claim that the number of modern slaves declines by 10 to 15% for the first time in a century. It's a clear, quantifiable demonstration that unified economic action, even when it's driven by self-interest, can finally start to solve these historical moral failures. And finally, let's turn briefly to climate action, which has historically been another victim of fragmentation, of blame shifting, and massive capital costs, the ultimate long-term coordination problem.
So, if the GSA is mostly focused on solving short-term chaos, how does the economic cooperation built by the agreement actually help the environment, which is a decades-long transition?
It creates the necessary financial bandwidth and, more importantly, the trust required for a large-scale energy transition, especially in the developing world. The sources specifically detail that China and India receive highly favorable low-interest loans from the European Union to facilitate their climate goals.
To help them transition away from coal and invest in green infrastructure.
Right.
So the EU realizes that if China and India don't succeed, the EU's own goals are meaningless. So they use a carrot of cheap money guaranteed by the GSA structure, rather than just relying on the stick of carbon tariffs.
Precisely. It's cooperation using economic incentives to accelerate a shared solution, and that's all driven by the realization that everyone loses if the transition fails. That economic certainty is only possible because the GSA provides the framework to ensure those loans are repaid and the commitments are verified.
So what does this all mean? The sources seem to suggest that a single, unified strategy global cooperation can unlock solutions to seemingly impossible disparate problems. From food waste in Iowa being instantly redirected to Yemen, to unifying the world's most sensitive nuclear sensor data.
And even enforcing global psychological health standards on tech platforms. What's so fascinating here is that the source material consistently frames this cooperation not as an act of altruism, not some great moral awakening, but purely as a cold, practical necessity.
It's driven by mutual self-interest and loss aversion.
Exactly. The GSA is a collective realization that the massive existential cost of global chaos, whether that's war, pandemic, psychological collapse, or climate disaster, now outweighs the cost of political compromise.
The GSA doesn't prove the world lacked solutions. It proves the world lacked the necessary mechanism, the political infrastructure, to apply those solutions universally.
Indeed, and that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. If solving the world's biggest problems simply requires prioritizing the protection of citizens' psyches and creating economic incentives for peace over historical competition, what specific piece of current fragmentation one that we didn't explicitly mention in this deep dive do you think is next on the list for a global cooperation overhaul? What structural risk do you think a single, unified AI module should tackle next?